It's the North Shore Drive podcast here on the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I'm your host, Chris Carter. We're joined by Brian Batko today. The Steelers lost Terrell Edmunds in free agency. He is going to the Philadelphia Eagles. What does that do for their draft plans? What's their top priorities? Has that changed? What other moves could be made? We'll talk about that and Penn State's pro day as Joey Porter Jr. was being looked at by certain members of the Steelers staff and other members weren't present. What does that mean? We'll get all of that right here on the North Shore Drive podcast from Chris Carter and Brian Batko. Let's get into it. You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter. And welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. As I said before, joined by Brian Batko. You can find both of our work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which you can read at post-gazette.com. You can find this show, the North Shore Drive podcast, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday on the Post-Gazette's all the podcasting apps. Look us up there. But also, if you want to watch us on YouTube, like this video, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily content that comes to the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Well, this show is Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We got stuff coming out all week long. In fact, I have a mock draft video coming out with Adam Bittner on Saturday, so stay tuned for that. Brian, it was interesting news Thursday. We saw Terrell Edmunds tweet out that basically first he did the salute emoji, and everyone's like, "What does that mean?" And then we actually got an answer within like a few hours. He tweets out, "Thank you, Pittsburgh." And, it seemed like there was no bad blood between his departure from the Steelers and free agency. And then Friday, early afternoon, he it's found out he's going to the Philadelphia Eagles. One, Brian, what do you think the hangup was there in bringing back Edmunds? Do you think the Steelers really wanted to, and he just wanted more money? Or how do you think that this played out as far as what was going on there in free agency?
Yeah, it was the rare case of a cryptic athlete tweet actually being a sign of what was to come. He could have been emoji saluting a lot of different things on Thursday morning, but yeah, then he comes out with the full-fledged tweet that is basically like the Magic Johnson, "I'm not going to be here next year." So we didn't know. I mean, it's also odd too that there was a good 24 hours and some change in between Terrell Edmunds being like, "Yep, I'm out," and finding out what his next team is. So it does kind of signal to me that maybe he just didn't want to go through that again. The whole, "Hey, go see what's out there. We'll see what's out there. We'll come back to you if you're still around." Maybe he did feel somewhat disrespected by that, and I think you could see where he's coming from if that's the case, because he has been so reliable. He's been a 5-year starter. He didn't pick himself in the first round, so those expectations are sort of those are more the Steelers' problem than his own. But it sure seemed like he wanted a change of scenery. Maybe he thought the writing was on the wall when they re-signed DeMonte KZ a lot earlier in free agency. And yeah, I mean, as I tweeted just a few minutes before we jumped on here, it makes a lot of sense for Edmunds to go to the Philadelphia Eagles. We don't have terms on that yet, right? We haven't seen any terms for his deal.
1 year.
Yeah, so it's another 1 year kind of prove it short-term deal for Terrell Edmunds. As you know, Chris, you get into year 6 in the league, you start losing the opportunities at getting those long-term deals. I mean, you almost get to a point where it's sort of 1 year deal or bust, and you better keep busting your butt and playing well to get people continuing to pay you, especially if it's anywhere close to starter money. But my point is, it could be the Eagles lost Marcus Epps and they lost Chauncey Gardner-Johnson under pretty controversial circumstances there. With it's a business, so that wasn't a great look for the defending NFC champs, but they went a different direction, and now that direction is Justin Evans, whom they signed earlier this week, and Terrell Edmunds too. So he will have a chance to start in Philly, where, of course, former Steelers director of pro player personnel Brandon Hunt is now in the Eagles front office. So obviously he has plenty of familiarity with all the Steelers players, and especially Edmunds, who he played a role in drafting him in the first round back in 2018.
Yes, certainly. That's going to be very interesting to see how that plays out there. But what does this leave for the Steelers, Brian? Because Edmunds wasn't the turnover guy that, Minkah Fitzpatrick, the other guys contributing turnovers, but he filled a lot of roles. He covered running backs, tight ends, receivers, whatever you asked of him, he was there. He was really good in the box, maybe not as so good playing, far deep in coverage, but he was an asset to the Steelers. And I think, and one that, last year came at a very cheap price, $2.5 million he made off the Steelers in a 1-year deal. And again, I'm with you. I get him wanting to find somewhere that he's like, if the Steelers aren't going to commit to me long term, I need to find someone who will, and I think that makes sense. But is this a big loss for the Steelers, or do you see this as something they'll be able to recoup without too much of an investment in free agency or the NFL draft?
I don't consider this a big loss. I think, Edmunds he's a divisive case. Who isn't anymore in the NFL and with the Steelers fan base in particular? Everything seems to be divisive for some reason. So he's no different, but, I look back at the 2019 version of him who there were high hopes for a guy coming off his rookie year when he was sort of unexpectedly thrown into the fire. And, he struggled a lot in that second season. I never like to say a guy loses games for a team, but because there's so many plays that happen over the course of a 60-minute football game. But he put it this way, he had some very significant mistakes that cost this team dearly, especially late in some games. Thinking back on, the Seahawks game in 2019, week 2, his tackling was not great at that point in his career. There were a lot of whiffs and missed tackles, which you just can't have against teams like the Browns and the Ravens in your division. But what I'm getting to is I think he cleaned up a lot of that over the last few seasons. The coverage was maybe a little bit slower to come into view, but didn't see him being as much of a liability last year, aside from, again, a game or two. Think back to the Cleveland game Thursday night, week 3. He was exposed a couple times one-on-one, but that's going to happen to pretty much every NFL DB, let alone every NFL safety at some point. So, he was okay. I think he improved. He was better than the guy that the Steelers didn't pick up his 5th-year option coming off of his rookie deal. However, I think DeMonte Casey showed at times last year that Edmunds is replaceable, and that's exactly what they did. They go out, re-sign Casey, and now I think it's a position where they can hit it in the draft and see if they find a longer-term pairing with Minkah.
We'll see what the plans are there in just a minute here. I want to talk about some of the draft option with Brian Batko. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back here on the North Shore Drive podcast talking about Steelers NFL draft plans and now impacted by a potential need at safety. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast, Chris Carter, Brian Batko breaking things down for you here. Brian, let's look to the NFL draft for a second here, because the obvious name that a lot of Steelers fans are going to yell at a screen as they're watching us right now is just draft Brian Branch, which, I get it. As far as safeties go in this NFL draft class, he seems like he could be an interesting fit there. He talked about playing with Minkah Fitzpatrick at the NFL Combine. Greatness
tends to find people named Brian B. I mean, that's just, an inarguable fact of life.
Yes, it's inarguable. Totally, all the Brian B's that I know are pretty awesome. But point being, this guy was pretty awesome for Alabama. A team leader. He played a lot of different roles for them. He could play in the slot. He could play strong safety. He could move around. Was very good at communicating. And the prospect of getting a guy like that to pair with Minkah Fitzpatrick would be enticing. And then you might be right back to your situation where you could roll 3 safeties out in a lot of formations and feel comfortable about it. But is that like a luxury with all the other Steelers' needs right now? Still, a lot of people look at offensive tackle as something they have to do. A lot of people look at cornerback as something they have to do. Defensive line, linebacker. There's a lot of needs. Is safety that high in this draft class a rational move that you think that would be on the part of the Steelers?
Not with DeMonte Casey coming back, because even though he is a pretty slight guy, he's small, he's fiery. I think that they really liked what they got out of him in his age? I think 29 season. He plays a lot younger than that. He's willing to stick his nose in there against the run. And you saw the ball skills last year. I mean, he had a pick in his first game, finally suiting up for the Steelers after spending most of the season on IR and also getting dinged for a suspension there for a few weeks. But Yeah, I mean, without him coming back, it would be very near the top of the list of needs for me because Miles Killebrew he's not that guy. He's a special teamer who can occasionally, very rarely, help you out defensively if you're at the goal line or something like that. And Trey Norwood, I kind of think he's settled into that role as a dime inside corner and can occasionally help you in a pinch as a backup safety. But I just don't know that he has the athleticism to be more than that. Nice player, smart guy. You want him around, but it's not like he's ready to ascend into some sort of starting role, especially as a safety. Maybe he's on their radar at slot corner, which they still haven't really addressed since losing Cam Sutton. But I digress. As far as safety goes, I could see it really with any pick for them starting at that second rounder. I don't know that the value is going to match up with their needs earlier than that, unless, of course, it would be a Brian Branch, who is essentially Minkah Fitzpatrick light a little bit. I mean, I don't know that he's as big. I don't know that he has quite the athleticism as Minkah, but yeah, you always hear about his position flexibility. He's always around the ball. He was a really smart player that Nick Saban was willing to move him around. And, I think he's physical enough to do all, check all those boxes. So 17, you could convince me, but it would really depend on the rest of the board, what else is there and the grade that you have on some of these defensive linemen and outside corners. But certainly if somebody like that slips to 32, seems unlikely, but I would be all over that if I were the Steelers, because I think when you're paying Minkah Fitzpatrick as one of the highest compensated safeties in the league, it makes a lot of sense to get a cheaper guy to play next to him and still do a good job as a starter in those two high looks.
That's where I'm at, is that the Steelers, you try to balance where you're paying, where your money's going, and when you're paying another person a lot of money, you don't want to have to, double down and paying a whole bunch of more money into that position, because then it takes away from the investments that you can make into other position groups. And that's why I thought that Terrell Edmunds might have been an option for the Steelers, because he got a 1-year deal with the Eagles. I didn't think he'd break the Steelers' bank. And if he was willing to take, kind of moderate money for like a 3-year deal, that might have been an option there. But a rookie would be an interesting option there. And like you said, maybe not in the first round, but maybe with that 49th overall pick, the 80th overall pick, where that could fall. Other guys not named Brian Branch that are in this draft class: Antonio Johnson, a longer safety from Texas A&M; Jamie Robinson, a physical safety from Florida State; Jordan Battle, a fellow Alabamian safety with Brian Branch; Christopher Smith out of Georgia; Ronnie Hickman out of Ohio State; and of course Jair Brown of Penn State, who we'll talk about in a little bit here. There's also guys, if you go way down, in a lot of different people's talk about Brandon Hill, the Pitt safety. He'd be there, but he'd be a guy you draft in the much later rounds. Is this a move where you think the Steelers, if they make a move in the NFL draft, they do it with an earlier pick, or they try to wait till like the later picks till day 3 and then say, okay, we'll take a stab at a safety here because you have KZ and you have Minkah Fitzpatrick. You don't necessarily need a guy who's going to plug and play right now, but with the versatility that Terrell Austin likes to roll out, that getting a guy who could be ready to plug and play and just be in a rotation could be a priority.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends how it unfolds, but I think, if you don't get one before your 7th round picks, at that point, to me, it almost might be why bother. I think I'd rather take an upside project type at wide receiver or offensive tackle, or as I wrote in my Steelers mailbag today, maybe quarterback again. I know some people don't want to hear that, but I sort of laid out the case for why it might make sense for the Steelers to go back to that well, even though the Chris Oladokun era was brief and not all that exciting. But, I think, if somebody like Jordan Battle's there at 49, even Jair Brown, it seems like he's getting a lot of buzz from, the NFL draft scouting community as being better than what his stock was pegged at coming off of his final season at Penn State. And, he's another New Jersey guy. I think he could fit well with Minkah Fitzpatrick from a personality standpoint, but also from a play standpoint, because he is very willing to throw his body around. He played in a Penn State secondary that was always really talented. He played alongside Jaquan Brisker for a couple years, and then he was the top dog at safety last season. So really like those two names, Battle and Brown. And I guess with Branch, it's just pretty much all Bs at this point when you look at the 2023 safety class. But yeah, we'll see how it plays out. Again, I think anywhere between that second round pick and maybe 32 if Branch is there. But then maybe through your fourth rounder, there's a real opportunity to upgrade with some of the prospects coming out this year. But after that, I think you'd maybe be reaching to an extent.
I hear you on that.
Granted, you can't really reach on a 7th round pick, but I just don't know that it would, be the best utilization of resources at that point.
No, I totally understand what you're getting at there. Now it brings me back to the NFL draft as a whole. Still, we've seen more teams make free agency moves. Now the Steelers have kind of settled in free agency. There's more moves that'll probably come at some point, but the big moves, I believe, have been made here by the Steelers, getting Smallwood and Herbig on the line, Peterson at cornerback, Ogunjobi's back, KZ's back. I'm probably missing somebody there, but point being, they've gotten their signings in now. As you're looking at the Steelers draft board, what you think their draft board should look like and what their priorities should be, do you see their priorities of having changed after all this time, or is it still kind of the same beat, like see if one of those top tackles fall, if not, go get your corner?
I'd probably jump tackle up into my top tier at this point. I think before free agency I would have said defensive line and corner are a clear 1 and 2. Now I've got tackle right up there, because if the season started today, there's just no depth at that position. Even Trent Scott, who was the de facto swing tackle last year, he has signed elsewhere. He's headed to the Washington Commanders. So Holcomb out, Trent Scott in, and vice versa for the Steelers. But not only do they need the depth, but could probably argue that you need somebody to push the 2 starters, whether it's Dan Moore Jr. or Chuks Okorafor. 3 dogs for 2 bones might be a scenario that Mike Tomlin very much wants to see, to say nothing of Omar Khan and Andy Weidel. So that's what's changed it for me a little bit. Offensive tackle moves up the list of needs, inside linebacker slightly down. I'd probably still have corner and defensive tackle at the top, but again, not much drop off between those two. And somebody who could step in as an instant contributor, if not an impact starter from day one, at left or right tackle.
Yeah, I'm right with you. I think tackle, with the investments that they've
made, and obviously, Chris, interior offensive line is, you don't need to do anything there. If there's like a center who you think has really dropped and you just can't pass them up, okay, I guess. But you've thrown a lot of money and a lot of investment at those interior positions.
Right. And also, I'd say like the money they've thrown at it has been reasonable. Like they haven't broken the bank. Like the Bengals went and paid 4 years, $64 million for Orlando Brown, an offensive tackle. And it makes me wonder if the plan here is because the guard and center positions don't take as much money to sign in free agency unless they're superstar players. You could sign in the interior and then draft on an offensive tackle, which would make a lot of sense, keep you in a relative price. And you get a chance to build your own guy, because right now, of all the Steelers' offensive linemen, none of them feel like the guys who could be pillar players for the next decade or something like that. They're all the guys that have been part of the team, were drafted by the team, Dan Moore and Chuks Okorafor. They're not of that ilk. I think that they're good. They filled in as best they can. The 2 best offensive linemen for the Steelers last year were Mason Cole and James Daniels, and those were free agents. But I do feel like the Steelers could really use a pillar player at offensive tackle who becomes a long-term kind of just a flag bearer for what the Steelers offensive line is going to be.
But I think they need that foundational piece at corner and defensive line too. Yeah, I think.
I agree. That's the tough thing about this draft class, is that you want that guy for a few positions here right now. And I think it's fortunate for the Steelers. Cornerbacks, a group that's going to have really good depth this year. Defensive line, I think there's going to be some. I wouldn't say nearly as deep as corner, but there's some good picks there that you can get on day 2 still. Offensive line, I think there's some good tackles who you could get on day 2 of the NFL draft. But I think that they're beyond wanting good tackles. I think they want a guy that's going to be like the Marquise Pouncey at offense at left or right tackle for the Steelers, who kind of carries them into this next decade of rebuilding the offensive line.
And it's fortunate that the Bears really wanted Chase Claypool, because now they have 3 picks in the top 50 to go and hope that the draft board falls their way to get, say, a Brian Brzee in the first round, Keely Ringo.
Bees, man.
All right, well, and I'll just say Brian Branch too in the second, and then I don't even know who would be your offensive tackle pick beyond that. Or how about this, Chris? How about a Broderick Jones falls to you at 17, Brian Brzee falls to you at 32, and Emmanuel Forbes is there at 49 to solve your cornerback problems as well.
Emmanuel Forbes would be a very interesting slot option there for the Steelers. He's a guy that really has good ball skills there. If Broderick Jones falls to 17, Brian, they need to run to the podium. I think that guy is. I think there's a lot of people that are putting him down because I think he kind of he wasn't fully polished of a player. But man, I think that he's going to be a problem in the NFL if they can get him at offensive tackle. I think that is your you got it. Go to the podium. Don't ask questions. Don't ask about trades. Just go get that guy out to your offensive line, and he can be a cornerstone piece for this offensive line moving forward. But Penn State's pro day is Friday. We're recording this Friday, and
someone's probably running the 40 right now as we speak at their pro day.
Right, Joey Porter Jr. isn't though. Well, I want to talk about who's there, both as far as Penn State prospects that could be interest to Steelers, and which Steelers staff members attended and what it says about the plans there moving forward. We'll talk about that right here on the North Shore Drive podcast in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Chris Carter and Brian Batko. We'll be right back. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast, Chris Carter, Brian Batko, breaking things down. Let's talk about Penn State's pro day right now, Brian, because there's a lot of eyes on this one because it's always just been said. The Steelers are just taking Joey Porter Jr., just get over it. It's going to happen. They pick family all the time, and it's just an obvious pick. He's a top cornerback, it meets a need. It all adds up. Joey Porter Jr. didn't run at the pro day, well, because he ran well at the combine, and I think that, but the pictures could be seen at Penn State's pro day of him talking with Terrell Austin for a while, as well as Jair Brown, the safety that Penn State's sending to the NFL draft right this year. But you look at that situation, Terrell Austin's talking to him. You don't see Mike Tomlin there, and you don't see Omar Khan there. And one of the things that's often been said is that the Steelers, when they're picking guys in the first round, their top brass usually goes to visit the schools where they think they're going to get their first round pick from. Is this a sign that Joey Porter Jr. isn't actually the move, or do people make too much of that concept?
I think there's something to that, but if there were ever a year where an exception would be made, it's not hard for me to envision Mike Tomlin walking into the Steelers media room that Thursday night of the draft after taking Joey Porter Jr. and somebody asking about, hey, you weren't at his pro day, and he'd be like, man, I've known that dude since he was in diapers, So I don't know that that's a huge deal. I raise a little bit of an eyebrow at it, but what I keep in mind, Chris, is NFL owners meetings are coming up. Tomlin's going to be there this upcoming week. These guys have been on the road all week at pro days. They've got families still. It's a time of the year that obviously they grind and they put in a lot of hours, but you still have obligations back at home. Maybe it just didn't work out from a travel standpoint. And again, they don't need to probably learn or know any more about the son of one of the great players in the organization's history. Terrell Austin being there makes sense though, because if I'm not mistaken, I don't think he coached with Joey Porter Sr. in Pittsburgh. I think he came in the following year. Yeah, I think he came in the following year as that senior defensive assistant and secondary coach. I believe his first season was 19, and Joey Porter's last season was 18. I'm just using my own knowledge of when I started on the beat to kind of help me out with that on the fly. So he is maybe getting to know a player that he isn't as intimately familiar with because of the circumstances there with family and in the organization and coaching connections and ties. So, and obviously that would be who's working a lot with him as the Steelers defensive coordinator. So they still sent some heavy hitters, even if it isn't the brass that we've become accustomed to seeing right there at the bench press, right there at the position drills. And as you noted, obviously this isn't a huge day for Joey Porter Jr. He got his pitch and knocked it out of the park out in Indy.
I agree. And I think that's one thing is that the Steelers, like you said, Mike Tomlin knows Joey Porter Jr. Literally, watched him grow up in Pittsburgh. Went to his high school game, like all that's on record. But Terrell Austin, I think he's been crafting, and you and I have talked about this. He's crafting a defense that favors the secondary being turnover creators. And Joey Porter Jr. not exactly known as a turnover creator at Penn State, and it makes you wonder, is that a good fit for what the Steelers are trying to do there? But still, as an athlete, you got to go there. You got to make the talk happen. You got to see how that plays out there. But as far as other guys, Jair Brown, he's a box safety for Penn State. He'd be more of an early day 3 type of pick, maybe with the 120th pick in the NFL draft.
I think he might go higher than that, Chris. I think he could. I think he could go on day 2. I do.
Ooh, that'd be interesting.
Because we spent the last segment talking about how this class is not exactly rife with safeties ready to play. So if teams look around the league and decide they're going to be missing out on some guys at that position where they need to fill it, then yeah, I could see him going in the 2nd or 3rd round.
I mean, certainly, I think he's put together some really good tape that could support, like, hey, I can fill this different roles. I just look at when I start stacking up people against each other as far as the safety group goes. I think that he could end up being the guy that kind of fills out and goes to that spot. But we've been surprised before. In fact, a lot of people thought that Terrell Edmunds was a 3rd round pick, not a 1st round pick. And believe me, we haven't heard a shortage of that being said in Pittsburgh.
Not that that's the greatest precedent for Jair Brown, but
and I'm not limiting Jair Brown to that prediction there. But I mean, if the Steelers are able to get him, that'd be an interesting add there as far as as far as other positions that they could be targeting. But I also think it's going to be really interesting to see if the Steelers start looking around and the other guys that they could get, from at different positions there, because we've talked about safety, we've talked about defensive line, we've talked about corner, but tight end is a position that they could still attack at. They have it. I think that tight end, there's some really good tight ends at the top of this class where if they were able to get one of those guys in the 2nd and 3rd rounds, they could get a potential starter to work with Pat Freiermuth and run a lot more 12 personnel. But Penn State has Brenton Strange, another guy that would be there, 6'3", 250 tight end who, also could be like an early day 3 pick.
Yeah, I was going to mention Brenton Strange. As long as Big Blue Zach Gentry is still out there on the market, that is another position that the Steelers have to consider what they want to do, because as much as I like Connor Hayward, you kind of said it right there, Chris. I don't know that you're putting him in line and running that 12 personnel with him and Freiermuth. Maybe you can, but I think clearly that the type of player that Zach Gentry is, that's how the Steelers need to complement their offense, and specifically Freiermuth in their tight end core. So whether it's Gentry himself or a rookie coming in here, you probably want a bigger bodied guy who can stay in home and block, who can do the dirty work. And the Steelers have, Mike Tomlin's always kind of valued that type of player, whether it was Jesse James, Matt Spaeth back in the day. So I think there's certainly something to be said for tight end maybe being a sneaky position for the Steelers. I don't know that they would do anything before day 3. That might not be the best use of your draft capital. But yeah, Brenton Strange being out there in State College, maybe that's they could do an all Nittany Lions tight end room other than Connor Hayward. But yeah, I mean he's on the radar. I think other potential late round guys would be PJ Mustipher as an interior lineman if they strike out earlier in the draft, although they haven't had great success finding defensive tackles late. Carlos Davis didn't pan out. Isaiah Buggs didn't pan out here. He's now on his 2nd contract with the Lions, which is kind of surprising, but good for him. Even guys like Josh Frazier, there's never really anything there. But and then the last name I'll mention from Penn State. Well, I guess it's 2 names because they're both receivers, Parker Washington and Mitchell Tinsley. I think Washington will be a middle round guy, but Tinsley could be, a late round ad, and maybe the Steelers can work their magic again, finding a receiver in the 7th.
Who knows? They could use more depth at wide receiver, and I for one have just been a person who thinks that the Steelers, if you think that you're getting the home run receiver, sure, pick it, but I think they got plenty of other needs on this roster right now that can support Kenny Pickett and support this defense that I think would take priority over an extra wide receiver to add to this offense. But we'll see.
You said Pickett twice.
I did say Pickett twice. But point being, I think that the Steelers, there's still a lot of doors open for them to go in this NFL draft class. We'll keep you updated with all of them, as well as our insights here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where you could read all of our work at post-gazette.com. And you can find this show, the North Shore Drive Podcast, on all of our podcasting apps, as well as on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Brian, you got anything lined up that people need to know about as far as something that you're working on?
Well, my Steelers mailbag dropped Friday morning. I mentioned that earlier in the show. So as always, give that a read. We'll be chatting Steelers Monday on the Post-Gazette website. I think Ray Fittipaldo's got another iteration of his mock draft coming out next week. Yes, always exciting. But other than that, no, we're just continuing to see what might happen here in free agency, or maybe it's going to slow down for the Steelers for a while, as it usually does late March and into April. Getting closer to the draft, Chris. It's speculation season in full swing.
It absolutely is. We'll keep you updated with all the speculations and all the things that are going on right here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Again, your host, Chris Carter. Thanks again, Brian, for joining us. Thank you, dear listeners and viewers, for checking us out. Check us out Monday. We'll be back talking things. Who knows? Maybe we're going over with Ray Fittipaldo and his mock draft that's coming up. We'll keep you updated with all things Pittsburgh sports right here on the North Shore Drive Podcast. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive Podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you're watching this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down below in the description.